So as you can see right here, I have my standard database app, or my app controller. If you notice, my app controller looks quite similar to every other app controller we've made. I have a reference for a private data frame in there, as well as a getter for that. My start method right now is empty because I'm not using anything with it. And so that one I'm just leaving as just a getter for that to get going for the app frame, but my start method is not doing anything special. We'll use that to provide some sample information and or provide a welcome message to our app. And inside my actual constructor, I simply call appFrame as new data frame, passing a reference to this so I can have that MVC relationship that we see over here in data controller and our data.view packages. Well, morning.data.view, morning.data.controller. So we can send that reference back and forth between it. If I hit my play button right now, I load my application up and it will start up with the amazing large green screen. As I said earlier, we're going to be using a lot of screen space for this as we're displaying the contents of our database. And as such, we want to make sure we give ourselves the ability to have enough screen space to use. So I set my original screen size on this to be 1000 by 1000. As you can see, here's my lovely pop-up window. It's huge. No one can miss this. It's also bright green. Now, what I'm going to do, we saw that my app just started up and ran. I'm going to quit this again right here to show that it's gone, but we're going to add a new reference to this. We're going to be doing a way of actually making sure we have access to our database, and as such, we're going to use a reference to our database controller. So as you can see over here in my controller package, I have a DatabaseController.java. This is separate from my app controller. My app controller is the one for the actual application. This controller is provided for use as the reference to my database. And so again, before I load my GUI, I'm going to create all references to my model and my controller sites. And so since my database controller is my controller package, it will load before my GUI as well. Again, I'm using the idea of having a single reference to my object, and I send that reference using the this keyword, which allows me to have a reference to it without having to create new instances of it or create a static reference to it as an object. I can simply just keep that object in memory and use it as needed. And so I'm going to create a new database controller passing reference to this. We've already seen that my app was running. And now I'm going to run this again. Database runner, as we can see right here, is showing. Exception, com.mysql.jdbc.driver. It crashed. It shut down. There was not an error or anything. I had a pop-up window that actually came up and just showed me some error message and just stopped. Why? Well, to see why, let's go ahead and take a look at my database controller. And this is something I'm going to recommend actively you take a close look at, especially in the idea of screenshots. And so we have right here, inside my database controller, we have simply a couple imports for java.school.asterisk to get everything dealing with SQL databases. We also have an import for our JOption pane because we'll be using that for all of our error messages. We want to handle messages or errors well and not just crash. So we're looking at doing some defensive programming. Because we're dealing with databases, we want to make sure our app just doesn't simply crash automatically. And as such, we're using the pop-up window as one of its actual real features to say, hey, here's a warning or a message of something that's happening. I have 3 data members right now that we're going to be using as the class as a whole. A string for a connection string, a connection object which relates to the actual database connection and hence has the name of database connection, and finally a reference to my database controller so I can actually keep track of what I'm dealing with. If we take a look inside my constructor, we see that we have that reference to the database controller already listed in there. We do the this.DatabaseController equals base controller, just so we can keep that reference alive and happy so we don't get null pointer exceptions. And inside my constructor, I also have a reference now to checkDriver. This checkDriver method is an important method. This is what will kick us out of our app. This is what I actually just had us call that forced my app to not run after this checkDriver test failed. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that. So in my method, checkDriver, it's a private void method. It's not going to be called externally at all. I have a try catch in here. We've done try catches before, so the code itself will compile just fine, as we can see, but we don't know if the computer can do this. There might be some resource or other thing available. Specifically, the class.forName passing it a string says, does this information exist? Do I have access to it in this project? And obviously, since the app shut down, I do not. And so what it did is I called my displayErrors message, and then especially just because of this, I called system.exit. I forced my app to close down for the pure purpose that I do not have a driver of the database in here, so I will not be able to do any of the functionality of my app. If you can't talk to any databases, you will not be able to do this app. So as such, I said, okay, shut down. We should probably put a little message in there saying it is going to shut down as well, but this is one that we know, and I want to make sure you have this referenced in your notes. We'll put it in our documentation, which we're going to be doing a lot of today. We need to make sure that if we don't have access to a database, we want this app to not run. It doesn't do us any good to run this app if we can't actually see the database. And so that's why we're calling system.exit on that. We're going to go ahead and take a look at displayErrors. And so in here, let me shrink my font down a bit so we can see this a little bit better. There we go. In displayErrors, we have a method where we pass it an exception. We use the JDBC dialog where we simply just say the exception, colon, and then what the message is on the exception. And then we use that new word we introduced last time in class, the instance of keyword, where we check to see if this thing is the type of another thing. So if this exception is a squeal exception, then we now know that this is a special exception with the database itself, and so we'll provide specific information about the database error. So the generic error message for just generic errors, but if it's a squeal exception, we will call the squeal exception structure, where we'll say the state of the SQL server and the error code of this specific SQL implementation. In our case, mySQL. So that checkDriver method makes sure that the driver itself is installed. Now, I have already listed the driver on your guys' class page and the Canvas page. It's listed there so you can download it and use it. And we're going to show you how to actually install that driver in your project now, and they'll give you guys some time to do it, and we'll come back to this video. So, to install the driver, we go over to our project. And this is how we install a jar to our existing code. I click on the project itself, have it selected. I right-click on the project and choose Configure Build Path off of the Build Path link. So I go to Build Path, and I would choose either Configure Build Path or Add External Archive. They're both going to take me to the same spot. So if we do Configure Build Path, we choose the External Archive section. I'm going to go directly to it here with the Add External Archive. The Add External Archive allows me now to add a jar file to my project, some specific information for my project that is not already in there. Now, I save mine in my database folder because for some crazy reason my database projects will link to my database folder in my documents folder. You should save it to the same place as well. And what there is there is a mysql.connector.java-some number-bin.jar. Now that's the actual full name of it. Now you can name it yourself mysql.jar. Perfectly acceptable. I'm leaving mine like this simply because of the fact that this way you would see what it would look like if you actually keep it for yourselves. So I click on that and I choose Open. And you'll notice now that in my application of Morning Database, I have a new section right here called Reference Libraries. I click on that down triangle of Reference Libraries and we have that reference to mysql-connector-java. So that means that that reference library, that jar file, is something that this project now can use. And so this is, we need to make sure we have access to that. And so that is now part of a reference library to this project. If you link on my link right here, you can also see that it points to /user/codeh/document/computer-science/database, saying the external archive is located at that path. I have a download link for you. You can download that there. It gives you a zip file. You want to extract that zip and get the jar file out of it and place it somewhere that means something to you. But then you can do that, and I will now rerun my app by hitting the play button. And hooray! My app is back. It runs again. So I now have my driver loaded. As you can see on here, we have that checkDriver method. And so that checkDriver method needs to make sure that this jar file is loaded on our machine. Because otherwise you have no ability to actually access any databases whatsoever. The next thing we have in here is we are going to add the setupConnection method. We have our connection string and our database connection, and So what we've written right here, we have one line of code we actually wrote for the idea of the check to see if the driver is there, and if it's not there, display the errors, then shut down. But only one line of actual code for the work part. We have one line of code for a work part up here, and we call our method. We're going to close this down. We're going to go to our display errors again. That's all that is just simply pop-up windows to show those errors. My setupConnection is the same structure, where I have one line of actual work and then deal with the errors. Notice, however, that this is specifically as a parameter. It is a school exception by default. And second, notice that I do not shut down my application. Not being able to connect to this specific database is not a shutdown-worthy event. We can make changes to our data structure that we're doing this. But this is how we will actually make the connection. We use our database connection as an object, and then we call the driverManager.getConnection method. So it is a static method on driverManager object. We don't make an instance of driverManager. DriverManager is a reference to a set of libraries that we would use inside SQL, and we pass it the connection string. So this one will run the code, however, it will not shut down the project if it doesn't work properly. It will merely just stop working at that point. So we'll go ahead and we'll save this and take a look at it and see what happens. So we'll call setupConnection. So we have that setupConnection, database connection. We have that line that we just looked at and we wrote. Again, like I said, we are calling that error message. We call it, and if it doesn't do it, we just display an error message. We do not shut down our application. So we'll quit this existing running one, hit play again. So it will run, checkDriver passes, it doesn't shut down our application. But wait, here we have our generic exception. Exception, the URL cannot be null. And then we get our squeal state. We get a squeal state of 08001. That's our server saying is its state or its status code. And then our error code, 0. So the database isn't giving us a huge error. The server itself is not crashing, but it's saying that the status is that. And we gave it a string that did not work, but notice that our app is running. The fact that our app runs means that we could connect to our application. We just didn't do it right. And that's because our connection string is set for null. So let's go take a look at that. Oh, look, here we are. Connection string. Do I initialize that connection string inside my object? Why no? No, I don't, because connection strings, or excuse me, any data member needs to be initialized in what part of the object? The constructor, yes, thank you very much. And so we need to do, before we call our methods, we need to initialize our data member of our connection string. We've already initialized the reference to our base controller. Our database connection is only initialized after we actually call setupConnection, so that one's taken care of. So first we need to now give our connection string a value. So this dot connection string equals quotes. Hey, quotes are not null, right? That is not a null value. So let's see what a blank connection string does. We hit play. We run this. Exception. No suitable driver found for. Yeah, that's really helpful. School state. 8001 again. And error code 0. And there's our app. Fantastic. So that blank that we just saw, that no suitable driver found for blank, was this. I don't know what this is. I don't know which connection to use. And so where this comes into play, we have a format we're going to need to learn and know. And so this is what comes into play for this. We have JDBC. Now, that looks like it should be an abbreviation, an acronym, Java Database Controller, but it's not. It's just JDBC. But Java Database Controller is a great way to remember it. And then we do a colon. And then, so that it indicates that we're using the Java Database driver. We then specify which driver we're using. In this case, we're using mySQL. SQL. So we're going to use Java databases as our controller. We're going to use the MySQL specific driver. And then we need to do : whack whack to indicate we're going to be dealing with our address for our database. And after the : whack whack, why, that looks a lot like a URL, doesn't it? And so what we do here is we give it the address of our database, in case, or the path to. So the path to the database, in this case, we're going to use simply localhost. I could type it out like this as localhost. I could also do the standard IP address of 127.0.0.1. I could give a specific web address, 95.16.32.255. If there happens to be a database at that location, we could use that. But you have to, of course, make sure it's actually a path to a database. This includes any subfolders. Our database is running just at localhost, so we'll use that nice and easy. We then have a slash after our path. So once we have our path to our database, and since we're just at localhost, it makes it really easy. Other servers will be more difficult. After that, we give a name for our database. So to find that out, let's go ahead and let's take a look at our database server, because I don't know one off the top of my head. Here we have our phpMyAdmin screen, and as you can see, we have a list of databases that exist on this server. So I will, in this case, I will pick schools as my sample database. So go back over to code, and I type in the name of the database. And so I have first the Java controller, the specific driver we're using after a colon whack whack to indicate we're using a URL, the path to the server, and finally the name of the database we're talking to. We will then show that we are interrupting a path by using a question mark, and then typing user equals root. Now, if we were using a real database and using this as a work function, we would never, ever, ever use the root login to get access to the database. We would also, if we're doing this, we would also make sure we have a password. But in class, we are not using a password, and we are using root, so we can make it so we can easily use the same database set for both AM and PM, and making sure we don't accidentally destroy other people's data without having to worry about doing permission sets. We'll talk about that as we keep going on. So for today, though, in class, we have our name of our database server, the driver that we're using specifically, the path to our server, in this case just localhost, a whack again to indicate we're going into the databases, the name of the database we're talking to, a question mark indicating we are interrupting the path of a URL to pass it information, in this case the user of the server. Our value of the username is root, indicating who we are actually talking to. And we are not using a password because our root user has no password. So now I have access to a connection string that specifies where, what, and who. So we've made that change. We saw what happened with a null string. It simply gives a null pop-up message, you can't be null. If you use a blank string, it gives you a you can't talk to blank. And now we're going to try it with a string that actually has information. So save again so we can make sure that we're good and happy. And the play button, because again, we're always playing our games here in Java. And my database runner connects to my server, and absolutely nothing happens. So we've now done the beginnings of our database controller. Now, we talked about one other thing in databases that we want to make sure we avoid. That's the idea of causing a corruption or introducing the ability to not get out of this. So the next thing we have to add to our controller is making sure we can shut down our connection. We want to make sure we close things. So we'll close this one more time and add one more method to our data controller. This will be a public method because it will be called outside of this object. It will be called from the database controller quite often. It's a void method just because we can. And closeConnection. And you'd be amazed at how hard it is to close the connection. Here we go. database connection dot close. Ah! Red underlines of doom. I move my cursor over my red underline of doom, and oh, I need to surround with a try catch. Oh, that's right. So I surround with a try catch option, and hey, look, here it does. It gives me my try catch, and it's a squeal exception. And we already have a way of dealing with those exceptions, those nasty things. I hate the letter E as a variable name, so current exception works. And instead of doing e.print stack trace, no, we have a method to handle our exceptions. We will call displayErrors, and we'll pass it current exception. So we've now added a new method, closeConnection. Our closeConnection, just like our previous connection, needs to have our setupConnection, needs to have the surrounding of a try catch, because just because I was able to access the database doesn't mean now that the network has gone down and I can't close my access to the database. These SQL exceptions are important, so we have to make sure that nothing has had a problem. The code works just fine, but something could prevent me from closing my connection. And as such, we have to be able to handle those errors. So we have a try catch basically on every single method that we write inside our database controller, where we try and do some set of code, and if it crashes, we must handle that exception. So this is where we are actually going to try, from this point on, especially in class, that any errors we have, we handle those errors with our code. In this case, we handle that error with the displayErrors method, which allows us to potentially go back and make a change to call that method again. Because this is, like I said, the goal in this is to make a more generic version of a database controller. My previous years I've done this. The database controller would only work for one specific database, and you had to rewrite it lots and lots of times. And so we're going to try and make this a bit more generic, so we can actually use this database controller structure for multiple things. Our first couple queries we'll make will be very specific, but as we get better with this, we'll make it so it can run and execute various queries on various databases, rather than rewriting the entire project. So, that being said, what I'd like you guys to do now is we have gone over some framework code. I want you to, at this point, start doing your documentation, especially on your data controller. Get that database controller documentation for it, making sure you understand what's happening with that. I especially recommend that you remind yourself of the keyword instance of, making sure you explain that in your documentation, because that is a special subset of that method and why it happens. And this would be a great chance for you to check with your neighbors around you that you're understanding what they're doing as well as what you are doing.